As a kid, I traveled to Africa every Saturday. Except Africa was a market in Harlem, and my passport was my grandmother, who insisted we wore African outfits to church on Sundays. This was hashtag for the culture before Twitter ever existed, and before we were debating whether Black people could appropriate other Black people on the internet. My grandmother inspired me to travel, from church road trips to gambling boats to our annual pilgrimage down south. Her mother was a migrant worker, so we've been journey women across our entire lineage. I remember being curious about those women in the market in Harlem. And I was also curious about my grandmother's friend, Kamau. He was from Kenya, and he was the only African I knew in real life. Other than that, it was Discovery Channel, Nat Geo, Travel Channel, and of course, Alex Haley's Roots. My brain and imagination were filled with a place that I could not place, this mythical Africa that I had pieces of but couldn't really make sense of it. But somehow, these little sprinkles gave me some conviction that if I ever had the opportunity to travel to this place, it would unlock something in me. Attending an HBCU, a historically Black college and university in America, institutions that were created to educate Black people after slavery and keep us away from being educated alongside white people, exposed me to an expanded and more nuanced view of Black identity than I had ever realized existed. You see, since I was born, Black immigration to the United States has actually increased fivefold. So Black foreign enrollment at HBCUs increased alongside of it. Now, in communities in New York where I grew up, native-born Black Americans lived in Bedford-Stuyvesant. And 10 minutes away in Flatbush was where you'd find African and Caribbean families. But this segregation was not possible at Morgan State University, where I went to school. Instead, I had to discover Nigerian men in tailored suits and pointy shoes that I didn't understand. I learned that there were Chinese Jamaicans, and probably the most important lesson I learned was that all jollof rice is not created equally. But it wasn't all laughs and spinach gravy. We had a lot of issues on campus. The same drama that erupts when Beyonce or Drake dabbles in Afro beats also happened on campus. You had students from the Caribbean or from Africa come to campus after being told, stay away from those Black Americans, and segregate into the African or Caribbean Students Association throughout our freshman year. But luckily for us, campus wasn't big enough for that. And so in those difficult conversations, we discovered each other, and we unpacked centuries of disinformation designed to keep us from recognizing each other. There was an African diaspora class that was a requirement for graduating from university. Except African diaspora class was happening every single day. One of my best friends in college was named Adjoa, and Adjoa is from Ghana. Ghanaians knew that already. And Adjoa and I would drive to class every day, and she would bump Ghanaian high life music and Afro beats before I knew that was a word. And one of the songs we sang all the time had a hook that I'm sure some of you know. It went, Sawa, sawa, sawale. Sawale. Asha. Those three S's replace the three S's that most Black people know about Africa: slavery, sickness, and safari. And I was so thankful to Adjoa for just disrupting that out of my mind. I'll never forget the wealth, the cultural currency that we exchanged on that college campus. It's so much a part of who I am today. After college, I took my biology degree and I parlayed it into a career in international development. It's kind of wild. The whole point of me working for the World Bank and the CDC was getting to Africa. Like, that was the point. What's crazy about it is that it never occurred to me to just save my money and buy a plane ticket. Couldn't fathom it. But I wasn't the only person that thought this way. There was a recent report on Africa in the US media by the Norman Lear Center. It's a think tank in Washington, DC. And they saw that after watching 700,000 hours of American television, there were only 25 major storylines about Africa. 14 of those were about crime. American audiences are more than twice as likely to see negative stories about Africa than positive ones. And it's not just on film and television. If you go on Twitter, a platform with the most woke CEO, most tweets about the continent are also about crime and disease. And where you do see positive tweets about Africa, they're largely about some NGO eradicating poverty, and that leader usually doesn't look like most of us in the room. How's that for controlling a narrative? Like many of you, I've been fed subconscious and very conscious stories that prevented me from wanting to actually travel to the continent. It seemed that getting my namaste on in Bali or backpacking across Europe were way better options than taking a trip to the motherland. The US State Department currently has a level 2 or higher travel warning for more than 60% of the countries on the continent. That means 32 nations, upon a simple Google search, are branded not safe by one of the most trusted authorities on travel in the world. It gets deeper than that. If you look at Nigeria, who has a level 3 warning from the Department of State, a very broad strokes, don't travel there warning, it doesn't go into detail to tell you that where terrorism happens in Nigeria is way in the north, where most tourists would never set foot. Now let's compare that to France, who has a level 2 warning, and where terrorism specifically targets tourists. The article is very clear to tell you that you should not stop traveling to France. I mean, it's just ludicrous. So I'd been engineered to never travel to Africa, but I'm a hard-headed, rebellious person. And so none of that was gonna keep me from what I knew was gonna be the next level of my life. So in 2010, I got on a plane and traveled to Sierra Leone. I remember landing at Lungi Airport in the dark, like it was very dark. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel everything. As the plane descended, I felt centuries of departure and distance close. I shook and I cried in awe of the fact that I had finally got there. I remember that month in Freetown and really around the country, like it was yesterday. I traveled hours to meet women who just a few years after a civil war in their country were using innovative village savings and loans programs to rebuild financial capital in their communities. I remember traveling to a place called Bo and meeting a chief who had a portrait of then Senator Barack Obama in his house. And I remember realizing he was way more politically astute about American politics than I had ever been. It was one of those things where the idea of a chief in a village was just completely torn apart. I also remember making my way back to Freetown and ending up at a nightclub called Old School, and ending up dancing on the top of a bar to the same music that Aja was bumping when we were in college. It was a full circle moment. Sierra Leone was everything I imagined in Harlem and more. It was resilience, and it reminded me that Black people can survive anything. That trip to Sierra Leone left me intoxicated, and I've been drunk in love with Africa ever since. Since then, I was able to go to more than 15 countries on the continent. I've been renamed Ya Asantewaa and DJ'd for Jack Dorsey in Ghana. I've partied with the most intelligent people ever in Nigeria. See, I knew I should have left y'all out. I found God on my own terms in Senegal. And I saw unimaginable views in South Africa. See what I did there? I also saw that the same Westerners who had been telling me my whole life that Africa was dangerous were quietly building vacation villas in some of the most prime real estate on the continent. It was very wild. So I started sharing my story on Facebook and eventually Instagram, just through pictures of me kicking it on rooftops in Nairobi and selfies in the turn up. And I remember my friends going, "What kind of Africa are you in?" It was like a consistent Facebook thread. And I realized this is the gap. The gap is to show people how to do it differently. And so that's why I started Tastemakers Africa, a technology platform that actually allows people to connect to the continent authentically. My goal was both to change the narrative on Africa through travel, but more importantly, to change the narrative on Black people to ourselves. Thank you. When I started Tastemakers, it was small group trips and a really dope Instagram because I like taking pictures. We took people to countries that I was familiar with, and we built brick by brick. We decided we would buck traditional tourism on the continent because, quite frankly, the tourism industry in Africa has been serving white people for way too long. So my decision was to tap deep. I mean, we Instagram DM'd artists and chefs and said, "Hey, can you host our group when we're there?" And we built a fabric and a community that I'm super proud of. And for 3 years, we slowly built a travel business. But I looked up and I saw that Uber and Airbnb were pioneering the sharing economy. And I thought to myself, if I've not learned anything else in Africa, I've learned that sharing is what we do. And community is how we build. And so I decided to pivot my business 1 year ago to a peer-to-peer marketplace that actually allows Black travelers to book tours and experiences hosted by African locals in their own cities and truly democratize what we did. Since doing that, thank you. Since doing that almost 1 year ago, we've served people with more than 2,000 experiences in 5 different countries. Next month, we will have driven $1 million into the hands of young Black hosts on our platform. Putting the benefits of tourism into the hands of the people. It's crazy when you think about it. I became an entrepreneur, a venture capital-backed Black woman entrepreneur, not because I thought I wanted to be the next Mark Zuckerberg, but because of what I found in Africa inside of me. It's something I never in my life thought I could accomplish. My 11-year-old son is in the audience, and I am so excited to be able to share with him the opportunity that the continent put in me. For me, colonization and the slave trade were our version of Eve eating the apple in Eden. It changed everything. In the same way that Christians look to the Bible to try to right that ship, travel to the continent has a chance to be our salvation. I charge each of you to travel to the continent and to do so with an intentionality that you've never done before. I don't just mean travel back to the country of your parents. I mean all 54. I want you to get rid of the cynicism, the stereotypes, all of those things that block us from seeing each other, and go back to the continent and share yourself. You'll be surprised at the gifts you're going to return to when you give of yourself. What I believe is after you're done traveling all 54, your next assignment is to take that same energy and that same curiosity into the diaspora. From Brazil to Brooklyn, from Paris to Paraguay, make sure you see us. Our wealth as a people is in each other. And once you tap into that, we will forever be rich. Thank you.